We are in Genesis chapter 36. Genesis 36 begins, now these are the records of the generations of Esau, that is Edom. This is the 9th occurrence in the book of Genesis of this phrase. These are the records of the generations, or these are the generations. The technical term for this is the Hebrew word toledoth. Toledoth, generations. So this is what he's describing. Now we're not going to read all of what Moses writes in this chapter, simply because many of the names would be lost on us. Some of the verses we're going to be looking at before we get out of 36. But there are significant reasons why Moses, through the inspiration of Scripture, decided to put this in this particular spot. You know, it's a good thing that you've got these kinds of things called cell phones, because you can take a picture of something that you don't have to literally carry with you. And so I took a picture of Kaufman's commentary on this particular point, and he makes some good points about this. He quotes one commentator who referred to this chapter as a, quote, list of meaningless names, end quote, suggesting that it is an act of penance merely to read it. Then Kaufman says, despite such a view, though, there remains an eternal significance in what is written here. First, he says this chapter shows that God continued to be interested in all people, not merely the covenant family, and that his ultimate purpose was the blessing of all the families of the earth, even as mentioned to Abraham. Second, it was just as necessary to register the generations of Esau as it was to register those of Jacob, in order to show that the Messiah did not spring from the former, Esau, but from the latter, Jacob. Third, Esau's intermarriage with the Canaanites resulted in the amalgamation with them, demonstrating the reason why God refused to the Israelites any foreign marriage. Fourth, the adoption on the part of Esau and his posterity of the monarchical system of government, kings, resulted in anarchy and the degeneration of the entire race, provided for Israel an object lesson which they should have listened to, but didn't. And then fifth, another purpose of the chapter was the showing fairness to Esau. Here we learn that it was Esau who voluntarily left Canaan and dwelt in Seir in order to avoid conflict with his brother Jacob. So for those reasons alone, and I agree fully with Kaufman in his comments there, for these reasons these verses should be included and were by the Holy Spirit. But for our purposes, we're not going to read the entire chapter. Notice in verse 7, or actually verse 6, then Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all his household, and his livestock and all his cattle and all his goods which he had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to another land away from his brother Jacob. He gives the reason. For their property had become too great for them to live together, and the land where they sojourned could not sustain them because of their livestock. So Esau lived in the hill country of Seir. Seir is south of the Dead Sea. And then he says, Esau is Edom. The Edomites would become a thorn in the side of Judah and Israel, for that matter, for many, many generations. You read the book of Obadiah, one of the shortest books in the Old Testament. Obadiah prophesies against Moab, yes, but also Moab is where Edom was located. So it's Esau's descendants that Obadiah is prophesying against because of what they did against their brethren, that is, their fleshly brethren in Israel and Judah. Interesting how all this ties in together. So he goes on to describe the records of the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites in the hill country of Seir. Look at verse 15. He says, these are the chiefs. Now the King James reads dukes. But this, the New American Standard rendering of it, is more accurate. These are the chiefs of the sons of Esau. Skip down to verse 20. He says, these are the sons of Seir the Horite, the inhabitants of the land. He goes on to list them. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 12 and 22, we read what Moses writes, that Esau's descendants displaced the Horites. which is an interesting commentary on what he says here. So Seir the Horite, Esau's descendants move in, displace them, and take over that area. Then skip on down to verse 24. These are the sons of Zibeon, Allah and Anah. He is the Anah who found the hot springs in the wilderness when he was pasturing the donkeys of his father Zibeon. There is a difference of opinion among translators if you are to render that phrase hot springs or render it a different way. I don't know how much difference it makes in context, but I would think that this hot springs rendering would be more accurate. So this would be in the desert region, the wilderness region, there in Seir. So verse 31 says, now these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the sons of Israel. Kaufman would make a very strong point, and I think he's completely on point on this, that this was included by Moses as a warning to the Israelites of adopting any kind of king over them. Now, higher critics would say this is evidence of later authorship. That is, someone far after the time of Moses inserted this verse as a commentary, and then they would say, oh, by the way, if that verse was inserted as a commentary, then how much more of Genesis and Exodus and on through Deuteronomy do we have that's inserted as later commentary? But you don't have to go to that extent to explain that verse. This is the Holy Spirit through the pen of Moses warning the Israelites about the folly of adopting kings over them, because he would simply have to say, look at what happened to Esau's descendants. Look at what happened to them in their regions. And look at the chaos that ensued because they adopted this human form of government. And so this would be a stern warning to those that would follow after God. Now, skip down to verse 40. Now, these are the names of the chiefs descended from Esau, according to their families and their localities by their names. Chief Timnah, Chief Alva, Chief Jetheth, Chief Oholibamah, Chief Elah, Chief Pinan, Chief Kenaz, Chief Teman, Chief Mibzar, Chief Magdiel, Chief Iram. These are the chiefs of Edom, that is Esau, the father of the Edomites, according to their habitations, in the land of their possession. The Edomites, the descendants of Esau, as we mentioned, would be later bitter enemies of Israel and Jacob. So Moses, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is including all of this for our benefit, yes, but primarily for the benefit of the Israelites. Now we get to the last major section of the book of Genesis, which is one of the most beloved stories of the Israelites and the Jews today. The two favorite stories of the Old Testament among the Jews are the story of Joseph and the story of Esther. And you can see exactly why. Esther's story we well know, a wonderful story about a godly woman in very, very difficult circumstances and standing up for the Lord in spite of the threat to her life. But Joseph, oh Joseph. Joseph's story thrills the hearts of young people, of little folks, as well as teenagers and college-age kids. And it also, yes, college-age kids are kids. But anyway, but not only them, us older ones too. Us older folks look at the story of Joseph, and we are thrilled by God's providential hand in the midst of all of this. So verse 1 of the chapter says, now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. These are the records. These are the generations. This is the 10th and final occurrence of this phrase in the book of Genesis. This is the last time he mentions Toledoth. This is the generations. He continues, Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now, a couple of things from this verse. One not so major, one pretty big. First, notice he was 17 years old. He was a young guy. He was a teenager. His brothers all in their mid to late 20s, possibly a couple of them pushing 30. Here he is, a teenager. Now, we've already seen the capacity of his brothers to do evil. How they are very easily spurred on to kill. They're easily spurred on to violence. That's the background. All of that dramatic buildup that I was telling you about last week, this is all leading to what we're about to see play out. This is all that thunderclouds building in the background. I'm a big movie buff, as you can tell. And at the end of the original Terminator movie, when Sarah Connor is driving off into the distance, she doesn't drive off into a sun-filled, clear sky. There's dark storm clouds brewing. Well, that's the kind of thing you see with this. There's storm clouds brewing around Joseph, and he's not aware of it. He's 17 years of age. And then the New American Standard Version says, while he was still a youth. King James Version says a lad. Other translations indicate he was a youth, a lad. Rodney Cloud, who was one of my professors at Amridge and still is at the Turner School of Theology, has a big problem with how the translators render this word. The word itself in the Hebrew text is the word na'ar. Now that means nothing to you, but think about it. Na'ar is used in the Old Testament in a number of ways. It's used to describe young boys and girls, no question, in certain contexts. But then it's also used to describe individuals who are not young boys and girls. Think about it. David, King David, the shepherd. Before he's king, he's a shepherd, remember? He's killed a bear. He's killed a lion. He comes up and sees this uncircumcised Philistine Goliath that's threatening the children of Israel. And he says, let me have a stab at him. That's paraphrasing. And so Saul is going to let him use his armor. He's going to give this little boy that's got the, no, he's not a little boy. Do you remember the only reason why David didn't wear that armor? Because he had not tested it. What does that tell me? That tells me that David is as big physically as Saul. Saul stood head and shoulders above all his brethren. David, the only reason why he didn't wear that armor is because he hadn't proved, he hadn't tested it. But David's described in the Hebrew text as a na'ar. Well, then you remember there was a prophet that cursed these young children, and a lion ate them by the way. Oh, how terrible that is that God would kill all these young children. No. They're described as na'ars. In the context, who is he talking about? He's talking about young, strong men. These are not a wipeout of young kids. These are young men. The Hebrew text in context makes that clear. What am I saying? I'm saying that he's described Joseph as a na'ar. What does that mean? That means he is above his brethren in some way. What does that term mean in certain contexts? It means that this is a young man of military age who is given responsibility. In Joseph's case, Dr. Cloud suggests, and I fully agree, that Joseph was more akin to a crown sheik. He was the chosen one by Israel, by Jacob, to be the leader. And that would explain some things going on forth in context. Yes, sir?
Is the same word with Abraham and Isaac, because it uses the word son and land?
I'd have to look at the text. I'm not certain as far as that particular context is. There are certain words that mean similar things in the Hebrew text, and the word na'ar is an all-encompassing word that, according to context, you can derive what it means. In this context, because of what is described by Moses, it's describing Joseph as sort of a cut above the rest of his brothers. His brothers have already demonstrated the capacity to do much evil. We've already seen that Israel has changed From the time when he was a young man, where he was not really following God as much, to now where he's completely devoted in his heart and mind to following the Lord. He's seen what his sons can do, and he also has seen what Joseph, his potential is. So having said all of that, let's move forward. He brought back a bad report about his brothers. This wasn't a case of a bratty young boy that's going to tattletale on his brothers, as has been described by some in the past. If Joseph had responsibility from his father to be over everything that his father had, would that not make sense? That if his brothers were not doing their work, somebody had to tell the head of the house? So Joseph was tasked to do that. Verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons. There's that family tendency again. We've seen it all the way back to Abraham, remember, and now we're seeing it again here. So that tendency to elevate one son above the others is there. In this context, it's a bit different, as we're going to see, but it has still led to issues in the family. And the reason, because he was the son of his old age. Israel has Joseph when he's an older man. He has a different outlook on life, a different perspective on things. He's more spiritual than he was when he was younger, and he's devoting more of his time to rearing Joseph in the way that Joseph ought to be brought up. And then he says, he made him a, New American Standard Bible says, vari-colored tunic. King James says, coat of many colors. You may have a version that has a note, full-length robe. Or maybe you have another notation, a coat with long sleeves. That gives you a hint that this phrase that's used by Moses is a little bit on the ambiguous side. It can be translated several different ways. Now, the King James Version translation is the most well-known, the coat of many colors. Dolly Parton recorded a song that was a big hit in the country music world about the coat of many colors my mama gave to me, or my daddy gave to me, whatever it was. I never was a big Dolly Parton fan, but still. She recorded that song based off of this. Coat of many colors. And sometimes we've, and I say we in a general sense in the past, have presented it to our little children, this coat of many colors, just spotty, always splotches of colors, almost like a patchwork coat. That's not what was made for him. But neither was it just a coat with long sleeves. That's not really distinctive. Or a full-length robe. Maybe. What is it, though? This vari-colored tunic, this variegated tunic. This seems to be, in context, a distinctive, luxurious garment. This is a beautiful garment that has been given to Joseph. Why? Because Israel just dotes on him and he just loves him more than all the sons? No. If he is something akin to a crown chic, as the word na'ar would possibly suggest, then this variegated tunic, this multicolored tunic, this splendorous robe would be what the crown chic would wear. Not a crown, no. Not some sort of mitre that he would hold in his hand or a scepter, no. It would be something to set him apart. This is the one that you answer to. All you boys, you answer to Joseph. He's going to report back to me. If you're doing your job, I'll know about it. If you're not doing your job, I'll know about it. Now, you tell that to a bunch of 20-something-year-old guys that have already shown a propensity to do damage and to do much mischief and ill. You think they're going to take that well? Go ahead. Yes. Yes. Those boys are not born by Rachel. It's by Leah and the concubines, as you mentioned. Joseph is the son of the woman that Israel loved. She's dead now. She gave birth to Benjamin and died in childbirth, remember? So there's that resentment. But then on top of everything else is the fact that Joseph is the one who has been set apart by Israel to be the designated leader of the family. So you got all of that dynamic that's in the background. And then Moses says in verse 4, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him. The New American Standard Bible says on friendly terms. Other translations say they could not speak to him in peace. Every time they talked to him, it was a confrontation. Every time they talked to him, it was this. No matter how much Joseph wanted to keep the peace with his brothers, he couldn't understand why they didn't like him. He couldn't understand why they hated him. And yet, that was the situation. That's the situation. You know, family problems are always bad. No matter how minor or how major they are. It's never a good thing. And this dynamic right here leads to tragedy. At least from our standpoint it does. So verse 5 says, then Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. As much as they hated Joseph up to this point, when he tells them the dream he's had, it just ramps up the hatred. You know, you hear about turn it up to 11, turn the speaker up to 11. That's about the way it is with these brothers. It's already up to maximum volume, and now it's even going to go past that. The hatred is just palpable. He said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf stood up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered round and bowed down to my sheaf. Now, could Joseph possibly be bragging about his dream? Possibly. We don't hear the voice inflection. We can't see Joseph's facial expression when he tells his brothers this dream. It's a possibility that this is the one time that Moses highlights something negative about Joseph. I don't really completely agree with that take on it. I think in his naivete, he's thinking, if I tell him this dream, it's going to be something of a conversation starter. Well, he misjudged it big time. Notice, then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Joseph apparently was a very talkative guy. He loved to talk. And his brothers were guys that just wanted to work, just wanted to do their own thing. They didn't have time in their mind to hear their baby brother or the next to youngest brother talk to them. Verse 9 says, now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, lo, I've had still another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him. Now that would be a strong indicator that at this point Joseph may have been feeling a little bit proud of himself. Why else would Israel rebuke him? Well, what does he say? What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? Israel's thinking, why are you telling us this? His brothers were jealous of him. That's an understatement. But notice, his father kept the saying in mind. Israel begins to think about this after Joseph tells them the dream. Perhaps Israel begins to think, you know, the Lord revealed himself to me more than once in a dream. Could this be the Lord revealing himself to Joseph? So Israel's got that in the back of his mind. This dream that he's having is not just coincidental. Then, verse 12, his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Now, Shechem was an area of possible dangers. You could be set upon by thieves or by those that did not intend well. And so, Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "I will go." Again, if Joseph is the designated crown sheik, as it were, by Israel, this makes all perfect sense. That Israel was sending him out to check on the brothers, make sure they're doing their job. Then he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. So he comes to Shechem. Does he find his brothers there? No. What happens? Verse 15, a man found him. We're not told the identity of this man. "And behold, he," that's Joseph, "was wandering in the field." He's where he's supposed to be. He's looking all over this field for his brothers. He doesn't find them. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock." Then the man said, "They have moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan, still doing what his daddy had told him to do, to go check on them. Now Dothan is about 13 miles north of Shechem, so he's getting farther and farther away from his father, farther away from where the sons are supposed to be. So Israel had good reason to send Joseph out to check on them, because they're not where they're supposed to be, not doing what they're supposed to be doing. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. Now the dramatic music starts even ramping up more. The storm clouds are even billowing more and more, and the thunder, you begin to hear the thunder roll. All of the years of spiritual neglect of these 10 sons is about to be culminated. The culmination of all that spiritual neglect, Jacob not rearing those 10 boys like they should have been reared, now it's going to come to fruition. They are going to plot against their own brother to kill him. Can you imagine? Can you imagine, those of you who have brothers and sisters? Can you imagine doing something to your own kinfolk? I can't comprehend it in my mind. I can't comprehend the level of anger and hatred that exists for someone to even entertain the notion of harming your brother or sister, much less killing that person. And yet, it is what it is. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him, and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of his dreams." Can you hear the callousness in that? The not caring attitude about life. Throw him in the pit, kill him, say a wild beast come and devoured him. Now we're through with him. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." That's Moses' comment. That's what Reuben's got in mind. Reuben's got in his mind, I'm going to save his life. We're going to throw him in the pit, but I'm going to come later when my brothers don't know about it, and I'm going to pick him out of the pit, and we're going to go back home. Everything's going to be done. Reuben's the firstborn. The firstborn, the oldest son, always has the most level head, or normally. The oldest of the brothers is going to try to be the surrogate father for the rest of them. You know, calm down, guys. What you're doing is not what we ought to do. And so he's going to satisfy them to a point. I know you hate him. You're going to get to do something, but not going to kill him. That's what Reuben has in mind now. So, verse 23, it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the very colored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. So they throw him in this deep pit. It's got to be at least 10 or 15 feet deep because he can't just crawl out of it. So they throw him down in there. There's no water, so he doesn't land softly. He lands hard. Moses doesn't tell us if he's broken any bones. We know he's beat up a bit because I'm sure when they stripped him of his tunic that they roughed him up. I'm going to try to take out their aggression on him to an extent. So they throw him in the pit. And then verse 25 says, then they sat down to eat a meal. Think about this. Here's these 10 boys. They done this to their brother and they sit down to eat. How cold and how callous and how uncaring somebody could be. And yet that's where these 10 boys are. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, surprise, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. What Moses doesn't tell us there, and what probably took place is they had a brief conversation as they were passing by. Where are you headed? Headed to Egypt. They could smell all this. Gives them an idea. Verse 26, Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Now, sit back and think about this for a moment. This is Judah. What tribe did Jesus come from? Judah. Judah. Judah says, I've got the solution to our problem. Let's sell him into Egyptian slavery. Solution? Also, what Moses doesn't explicitly say, but what is clearly implied as we're going to see the rest of this chapter, is that Reuben is not a part of this conversation. Reuben's intent all along is to come back later and get Joseph out of that pit and bring him home. He's not part of this conversation that they're having, obviously, and I'll show you why in a moment. Verse 28, then some Midianite traders passed by. So they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. That's a slave's wage. And then Moses says, thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now, you skip over to chapter 42 of Genesis. And in chapter 42, verse 21, notice what they said to one another. This is many years later. We're going to see this when we get to it. Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. Reuben answered them, saying, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? So Moses gives us inspired commentary about what's going on here. What we haven't been told by Moses in this context is this whole time that they're eating the food, they're sitting down eating the meal together, what's Joseph doing? Just sitting there twiddling his thumbs? No. Joseph is pleading with his brothers. Save me out of this pit. Please, please get me out of here. And they don't hear him. They refuse. Reuben pleaded with his brothers. Don't do this against the boy. Reuben, as the oldest, has been trying to intervene for his brother Joseph, and they don't listen. Verse 29, Now Reuben returned to the pit. Reuben doesn't know about the plan, the plot that they have to sell him into Egyptian slavery. And behold, Moses again used that word, surprise. Surprise. Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments. Now there's another possibility. It's a possibility that in the initial conversations that the 10 sons have about selling Joseph into slavery, that Reuben really intervenes for Joseph. And he thinks when he leaves them that he has prevailed, but when he leaves, the boys get together and say, let's go ahead and do it. That's a possibility too. In whatever scenario you look at it, Reuben expected Joseph to be in that pit. He expected to get him out of it. And when he wasn't, he tears his clothes. What am I going to do? He returned to his brothers, verse 30, and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? What am I going to do? I'm the oldest. I've got responsibilities. What's going to happen? So they took Joseph's tunic, that variegated, multicolored, splendorous robe, and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. Ooh, do you hear the hatred in that? Look at this carefully. Just dispassionate. Look at this coat and see if it's your son's tunic. Not our brother. No. We're not, oh, something's happened. No. Look at it, see if it's his tunic or not. Then he examined it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. He imagines the very thing that the brothers devised. And what does this harken back to? Harkens all the way back to when Jacob was a young man, and what does he do to Isaac? He deceives him. It's all come back around, you see it? But Jacob, Israel, is not aware that Joseph is alive. He's been deceived just like he had deceived his own father. So, verse 34 says, Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Sackcloth. Sackcloth was normally a coarse, dark cloth made of goat's hair that someone would put on when he was in mourning for someone who had died or some kind of disaster that would happen. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Jacob's refusing all efforts. And he said, surely I will go down to Sheol, to the grave, in mourning for my son. Sheol is the place of the dead. I'll go to my grave. I will die mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, Moses inserts this. The Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. Pharaoh means great house. And there's a significance about this that we're going to see once we get to chapter 39 when the story picks back up. Who is on the throne in Egypt when Joseph enters that nation? Is an interesting story. That is, if you do the timetable and compare where this is to where the timetable of Egypt is, it's fascinating and it explains a lot concerning Joseph. But he's there at Potiphar's house. Pharaoh's officer, captain of the bodyguard. This is a man of importance. This is a man of means. God's providence is going to be with this 17-year-old boy who's in a foreign land, has no idea who's there, has no idea what's going to happen to him. All he knows is that he serves the one true God that his fathers have served. That's going to carry him through. Now next week when we get to chapter 38, Moses is going to do another one of these sidelights. In other words, okay, all this going on, let's focus on this side story. The side story is significant though, because it involves Judah. And it is a story in chapter 38 that you could just about snatch from today's headlines. So we'll look at all that